Hello and welcome to this week's edition of 50 Years Serving the Island, where each week we bring you highlights from the Manx Radio archives as we celebrate 5 decades serving the public in the Isle of Man. In 1968, Manx Radio was transferred into public ownership to become the island's public service broadcaster. Today we bring you a programme featuring the voices of 2 men who for decades were synonymous with the farming community in the Isle of Man. The forerunner to Manx Radio's Countryside, the farming programme, was broadcast for many years and was presented by John Kennaugh. And as we approach the season of Hollantide, in this edition of the programme, first broadcast in 1996, John talks to Harvey Briggs about the traditions surrounding the season.
Hello and welcome to this week's farming programme. This is a significant time of the year in the agricultural calendar. I don't know how many noticed last Tuesday, but we actually celebrated Hollantide Day on the 12th of November, and this is indeed a significant date. It was the date when tenancies changed on Manx farms, before which there would have been a number of farm sales. But to retrace how Hollantide Day has been celebrated in years gone by, when it really was very important, we talked to Harvey Briggs, who remembers a lot of things that happened round about Hollantide. Here's Harvey.
Well, I think it was a time of high adventure for a lot of people because they felt that it was the start of something new in their lives. But on the other hand, it was probably a time of sadness for many too, because it was the old feudal system. It was a relic of the old feudal system in farming. We had the landlord, the tenant, and the worker, and everybody knew their place. It was a sort of a trinity, and people in one of those categories rarely moved up. Sometimes moved down, but rarely moved up. And it wasn't, I don't think it was a very good system, really. It went on, of course, for many years, in as much as that, I suppose, in our lifetime, certainly in my lifetime, 85% of the men who farmed the land were tenants, and they depended on the landlord to give them the farm, to let them have the farm. And until we had tenant security in the Isle of Man in 1968 and 69, 30 or 40 years behind Britain, until we had that, there's no doubt about it that there was this system of a hierarchy all the way through. The landlord seemed to inflict his power on the tenant, and the tenant inflicted his power on the workers.
And why was November the 12th so significant then? Was that just a convenient time of the year for the farming year to end or begin?
Oh yes, I think so. It was just that mostly by then the potatoes were up, the crops, that was the last crop to come out of the ground. Everything was out of the ground except the green crop, the turnips. And if a man took a tenancy of a farm on November the 12th, he was generally allowed till, I think it was February the 12th, to get them off. But apart from that, the land was fairly bare. The livestock, the cattle and horses were all indoors for the winter time. They generally went in at the end of October, beginning of November, so it was a convenient time for that. It was a slack time on the farm, and a time when farmers could move from one farm to another if they had to, and when the men too could move from one farm to another too.
Now, you said a bit about the system of tenancy. So was there great movement then from farm to farm at Hollantide?
Oh yes, as many as we'd have as many, often as 15 farm sales at Hollantide. Now we're lucky if we have 2, and often they're not tied to Hollantide anyhow.
But they were for farmers actually going out of farming, weren't they?
Well, yes, that's right, for farmers going out of farming. But don't forget that in those days we'd have 1,200 individual farmers, down to less than 700 today, and some of those are only part-time farmers. So things have changed a lot there. And of course it was the time mainly as not only for farmers changing farms, but for the men and the maids. Don't forget there were lots of maids living in the farmhouses. You were talking a few moments ago about sitting here on each side of this room. Well, this was the old chollag. We've got the remains of the chollag here. If you open these cupboards, that's the old chollag, because this house goes back 450 years. These are the stone walls that you can see, the sheer thickness of them. And I'm determined, as long as I live, to keep it as it's been for many generations of farmers. I mean, we've had generations and generations of farmers here. The only thing that strikes me at the moment is that the last 3 farmers in here have not had any family. But we haven't had any yet. So.
And the point you're making, Harvey, that there would have been men servants and maid servants here at Ballycommerton?
Oh yes, the room, the men could come into the room outside here without coming through the house. You can still see out the yard here if we go out. I can still show you where the old steps went up to the men's room, and there was no access from that room into the house. And it was only in recent years that we built up that doorway and put a window in and put access from the house. So a man, if he was that way inclined, went to the pub, he could come home without disturbing anybody, or of course some of them, well, the men we had didn't seem to be that way inclined, and they often came in for supper before they went up there. But about 10 o'clock the back door was locked, so if they came after 10 o'clock, well, they'd had their supper.
How would they come to be in a particular job then on a particular farm? How were they engaged?
Well, it wasn't a system that I liked very much, because I know my uncle was a tenant farmer all this time, and it was only in the last year of his life that he was able to buy this farm. And he always had workers, well, even after he bought the farm he did, of course, but he was inclined to, I suppose, it was done, everybody did it, inclined to inflict on the workers the same sort of discipline that the landlord put onto him. And I remember that, of course, the first hiring fair of the year was Michaelmas, the second Wednesday in October, held for some time immemorial, I think, at Michael. And often farm men would go there and hire, and then they would be fixed up. They knew where they were at the second Wednesday in October. They knew then that they had a job when November the 12th came.
So it was almost like an agricultural labour exchange.
Yes, exactly. But not every man, certainly only about half of them would hire at Michaelmas. And my uncle, his men, and particularly the man who was with us for many years, the late Albert Sale, a great friend of the family in later years, he was with us 12 years. But my Uncle Jim McCubbin, he never ever said to him before Hollantide morning, that's November the 12th, he never said to him, "Are you staying on?" He'd leave it, and Albert would never go to look for another job because he was quite happy, but he never knew when he got up on November the 12th where he was going to sleep that night. And he wasn't the only one. Right. There were many like it, and that was the old system amongst farmers, and consequently it wasn't a very good system, and even then the wages they got were pretty poor, really. But on the other hand, the single men had a house, had a home, they had somewhere to sleep, and they had good food. Most farms provided good food. You talk about the pay, I've got a record here of one man we had on November the 12th, 1939. I recorded in my diary that Billy Kelly of Clovenstone's Cottage, Baldrine, he was hired at 16 shillings per week, that's 80 pence per week, with full board and insurance. And he was quite happy.
Yes.
But you see, he was more or less an orphan, in as much that his mother had married again. He wasn't wanted at home. He had to have a home. So as a single man, farming suited him. We weren't by any means his only employers, because he travelled around several farms. In fact, the poor fellow, he was stone deaf, and he was killed on the road at London some years ago. But he was one of the typical farm workers who went from farm to farm. I think he stayed with us 2 years, and then he decided he was moving on and that sort of thing.
Well, I remember Billy Kelly because I remember when I was working in Ballymenic with
right.
Kelly's, and we'd always meet him on mill days. Billy Kelly would often be a man set to feed the mill, and I'd be maybe cutting on the board, and Billy would be feeding. So I did know Billy Kelly.
Connor, he was known as Connor.
That's right.
You know, he told me once how he got the name Connor. When he was a boy, he was always pretending to be a steam engine, and he was going chuk 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 chuk. And when a steam engine goes downhill, it goes Connor 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 because it's getting held back on the piston. So from then on, they called him Connor.
But the countryside was full of characters in those days, wasn't it? I mean, and it was probably that system that you've just described probably bred these sort of characters, didn't it? Men who went about the countryside from farm to farm like that. There was a lot of them about. But it's interesting that you mention men being asked to stay on at Hollantide on Hollantide morning. And I must have been right on the tail end of this system, because I can well remember working with Tom Kissick in Bolacross, and he would always say to me on Hollantide morning, "I take it you're staying on for another year."
Yes.
And that was still the tail end of that system.
But on the other hand, John, you weren't a hired man were you? Did you reckon to be a hired man?
Yes.
You were a hired man?
Yes.
Oh, well, you know what.
Oh, yes, I was. And yes, that was quite an experience, that, looking back on it now.
Yes.
But farms changed hands as well, didn't they? And farmers moved on, and new farmers came in. It was a great shifting time, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
for that sort of job, you could hardly have had a worse time of the year, I suppose, with the dark nights and the short days.
Sure.
And farmers moved, I suppose, great distances in the island from farm to farm, and would all have to be done within the space of maybe 1 or 2 days at the most, perhaps.
Oh, yes, yes. We moved here in 1938, Hollantide 1938, from Ballabeg, from the farm which is now the site of the abattoir and the creamery, and we moved to Ballaculamartin here that year. And the thing I always remember about it was that we drove all the cattle, sheep and unbroken colts up Johnny Watson's Lane, along the Balnard Road to Parkfield Corner. No traffic lights then, of course, but straight out through over Glencrutchery Road, through Onken and up here. No problem at all. There were 4 lads, all on bicycles, and I was in charge of them. I was just like John Wayne, moving a herd of cattle, and I was coming behind on the bike, shouting out orders. And we had one lad going on ahead, and his job was to shut garden gates. And every garden, every house had a garden with a wall round it, or a fence and a garden gate. None of the open plan estates, so it was no problem. And then we had with 2 others riding herd on the side on bicycles. We no problem bringing them through.
But the point would be, though, that people that you would meet on the road by way of traffic, and also those who lived along that road, would know what you were doing and would appreciate what your job was.
Right.
And that's not quite the same today, is it?
No. You wouldn't. I understand there's no rule, no law against it yet, except in Douglas, which made a law some time ago that you mustn't drive cattle through. But I've often thought that I'd like to drive a herd of cattle right through the middle of Onk and see what happened, because there's nothing to stop you doing it, not by law. Yeah. If you want to join me?
You're listening to 50 Years Serving the Island, a series of programmes featuring highlights from Manx Radio's archives as we celebrate 5 decades serving the public in the Isle of Man. This morning we bring you an edition of the farming programme from 1996, where John Kennaugh spoke to Harvey Briggs about the season of Hollantide.
You mentioned Hollantide Fair. Where was the Hollantide Fair held, Harvey? Do you remember the Hollantide Fair being held?
Yes, I remember it. Just no, it went on for a good many years after the war. I think it was during the 1950s it probably stopped. It was held latterly in a yard at the Adelphi Hotel. The Adelphi Hotel was down by the old police station just below Athol Street, and it was held there on November the 12th. I don't know much about the Michael one because that was outside my territory, but the men used to go into the hiring fair, and on November the 12th and hopefully by midday they would have got fixed up. But one of the most pathetic sights I ever saw, I ever witnessed, I was going down the hill, in the Whitebridge Hill here, from here, walking into Onken on the evening of Hollantide Fair Day, November the 12th, and I met an old farm worker I knew coming up the hill, and he had all his worldly goods in a brown paper parcel, because in those days he hadn't a case or anything like that, but he had his best suit on, or generally a blue serge suit we wore in those days, blue serge suit, and he was carrying with him his hobnail boots, pair of working trousers, overalls maybe, and clean shirt or two, and maybe a change of underclothes. And he had all those, and he was coming up the hill, and he said to me, I haven't got fixed up. He said, I'm not fixed up. And he said, do you think your boss would let me sleep on the loft tonight? I've got nowhere to go. Because he was one of these men who was, as Billy Kelly, dependent on having a regular job and a farm to go in. Well, he was getting to the evening of his life. I suppose in his 60s. He was slow, not the very best of men, but given a lifetime to two various farmers. And I said, oh yes, I'm sure he will. Go up and knock on the back door and he'll let you in. So he stayed with us here for about 6 weeks, and he got his food and he potted round, and in the end he did get a job, but he went on. But that was the sort of position that so many people were in. And even the married farm workers weren't a big lot better off. They were generally fixed up before Hollantide because they had to have a house. But then, you see, they had to take a job where there was a house, and not every farm had a house. So often enough it was a case of taking a job because there was a home for themselves, and often big families in those days, and that's the way they had to always take a job, even if it wasn't the best one that was available. And of course, I remember meeting a chap in Douglas he went on to drive a baker's cart for most of his life, and he used to come up here delivering bread, and he said, farming, he said, I loved it. He said, I did 1 year out in St. John's, John, not far from you. He said, I did 1 year of it, he said, out there, he said, and I loved every minute except for one thing. What was that? Spuds and herring, breakfast, dinner and tea. I stuck me year, he said, because I'd taken me shilling. I stuck the year, but at the end of that time, I moved back into Douglas, and I never worked on a farm since.
Right. Now, when a farmer came to the end of his farming career and he was retiring, he would have a farm sale. And we've had 1 or 2 farm sales this year, but nothing like the crop of sales that there used to be. Even in my younger days, we would see maybe 12, 14, 16 sales at Hollantide. What memories do you have of notable farm sales, perhaps, that maybe you remember or that you attended, or the characters that actually attended those sales?
Well, of course, nowadays we drive there in our cars, and you just go there and park, and then when you've finished your business, you can go off home, and it's so easy. But I remember from here, and one would be just in the years after the war, when petrol was still scarce, and there weren't many vehicles of any sort. I remember going to a farm sale at the Barony at Mackeld, and walking to a halfway house to get the electric tram, taking the electric tram to Bellajora, I think it was, somewhere, and walking out to the farm sale from there. But of course it was a day out for us then. And another thing, of course, was that when we got home, the day was our own. We'd taken it off as a day off, and I wasn't buying anything, but I wanted to see the place and see the farm and see the life of the day. But when you could come home when you were ready. You didn't have any work to do. But nowadays it's also changed that if you do go to a farm sale, you're there for a couple of hours, 3 hours, and then you've got to come home to do the fixing up and the work at night. So times have changed a lot in that respect.
But you do describe it so aptly, Harvey. That's exactly what it was. It was a day out, wasn't it? It was a
Yes.
social event.
Yeah.
You went to see the farm, to meet the people who were there, and to discuss the farming topics that
That's
related to everybody there. And
Yes.
that was the great thing about it.
Yeah, and we used to get a cup of smoked coffee. There was always a man that from the auctioneers who used to stoke. They had boilers, you see. There's old Jimmy from Crystals, and he used to go down collecting wood to stoke up the fire, and he'd get it going, and he got this fire going in a big pot or something on it, and he made this coffee, and it was terrible stuff. But you were a long way from home, and nowadays, as I say, nobody's more than half an hour away from home, so they can go home for a meal. But in those days it was a full day. So with that and 2 buns, not unbuttered, 2 stale. Well, no, it would be fresh enough, but and by goodness, you devoured them because you were hungry.
You really did. I can't help but laugh, Harvey, because I'm remembering the same man on the same occasion, and you would look to see where the Thorkin of smoke was going up, so that you would know where the coffee was. And
Yes.
I remember Jimmy. Do you remember those mugs that he used to have?
Yep.
Yeah, they were dreadful things, weren't they? All shapes and sizes with all sorts of printing on them, whatever they were.
I'm told they're still stored somewhere. Yes, I was doing an article some time ago on crystals, on them reaching a certain anniversary in their lifetime, and I was told that the mugs are still there, so if we ever start farm sales on the old scale again,
the mugs are ready.
the mugs are ready.
But they were characters themselves, weren't they? I mean, one of the most respected personalities in farming in my time, or 2 of them, was Fred and Turner Crystal.
Yes.
They were great men in the agricultural scene, weren't they? And
yeah.
I suppose it was fair to say that there were other auctioneers indeed, but Fred and Turner Crystal would probably conduct the majority of the farm sales.
Oh yes, yes. And you talk about the big sales, but there were smaller sales too. Because I remember a neighbour of ours, he's dead now, his wife is dead, and his son is dead, so there's no secrecy about it. There was no secrecy about it in any case, but he was William Kermode, who farmed at Belig, a little 60-acre farm over here. He was a tenant farmer, and the day came when he decided to give up farming, and the farm was sold, but he didn't want it, the son didn't want it. And it was about this time of the year, Hollantide, and it was a dreadful morning. I'd been helping him, I'd been sorting the sheep and the cattle, and I went over to help, and about 11:15, and the sale was due to start at 11. There was hardly a soul in the place. And I thought, here's a man. I said to Fred Crystal, I feel sorry for Willie Kermode. He's come now to the end of his days. It's the last thing, last sale he'll have, the last money he'll ever have in. And I said, there's very few people. Looks as though you're going to have a poor sale. And Fred Crystal said to me, don't worry, it only takes 2 men to put a price up. And by 11 o'clock, I suppose there were a couple of 100 people there, and he had a very good sale. But what I was going to say, it was 1961, I remember the year well, and he stayed on the farm for a bit because the chap that bought it didn't want to move in for the time, and he stayed in for a little while. And Willie Kermode came over the field. There's a track, it's the next farm to here, so he came over the field, and he was waving this thing in his hand, and he said, look at that, he said, £2,000, he said. £2,000, and that was for his stock and his implements. But it was wonderful in those days. 1961. He said, "I'm never going to work again." He said, "You're fools." He said. Well, he went into Douglas. He'd been left a house by an aunt, so he had somewhere to live. And he went in, and it was just at the start of inflation, because the very next winter he was up here looking for a job thinning turnips. Right. He said, "You can't live." He said, "I can't live on what I've got."
Right. Yeah. It's amazing. But we mentioned Fred and Turner Crystal there, and as I say, there were other auctioneers. Certainly in my time, I can remember Arnold Callan selling for Isle of Man farmers, and Eric Howe selling for Central Marts in his day. perhaps you can go back maybe a bit further than that. Can you remember the auctioneers of a day previous to that?
Well, of course, contemporary with the ones you mentioned was Raymond Riley.
Oh,
Raymond was
of
a very
course.
good. Yes, Raymond was a good auctioneer, and he
Yes.
conducted a lot of sales.
Now,
And
Raymond Riley, over Riley's door, there's a name of an auctioneer from a
That's
day
right.
gone by, isn't there? Just the top of Queen Street,
Well,
just on Riley's
yes,
shop.
J.T. Farragut.
That's the one I'm thinking
Farragut.
of.
Yes, well, that was Raymond's father-in-law, wasn't it? Yes,
Right.
father-in-law. That's right.
Yes.
No, yes, that's right. Anyhow, no, grandfather-in-law. His Raymond's father was Jack Riley, and he was an auctioneer too, and he'd taken over from his father-in-law, who was John Thomas Farragut. And one of the things Raymond used to tell me, even in his younger days, he remembered that they kept a stable there where the farmers came in and put their horses when they came into town on the Saturday afternoon, and they would stay there till 10 or 11 o'clock, some of them till the pub was shut, others till they felt to go home, because if you didn't go to the pubs, you walked backwards and forwards through Strand Street and met on Boots Corner, got all the news, because we had no television, radio, no Manx radio then, good heavens, no. So nothing there. But anyhow, yes, he was, and of course before that there was an auctioneer called Arthur Dick who was very good. He was exceptionally good, and he sold at all free marts, because the free marts were going full bore in those days. Ramsey on a Monday, Ballasol on a Tuesday, and St John's on a Wednesday.
Yes. It's moved on a long way since then, hasn't it?
Yes. Oh, yes, yes.
Do you regret that age has passed?
Well, some of us are very lucky we've still got good neighbours, but I think the spirit of neighbourliness has gone. In some areas, it's still here. I mean, I could always call on one of my neighbours and do often have to if I'm in trouble. But really, we miss the old mill days. I first met you at the mill day, John,
That's
over
right.
at Ballymena. That's
right,
many
Harvey.
years ago.
We did.
We miss those. Those were great days,
Yeah.
and things like that I do think is obviously missing from our lives today.
You've been listening to this week's edition of 50 Years Serving the Island, where we brought you an edition of the farming programme from 1996, presented by John Kennaugh, who was speaking to Harvey Briggs about the season of Hollantide. And you'll shortly be able to hear this programme again, along with lots more exclusive content from Manx Radio's archives, by going to manxradio.com/portal.